The following lecture by University of Chicago professor Linda J. Waite was delivered at Brigham Young University on February 11th, 2010.
So today what I want to talk to you about is marriage as a social institution and what we know about the effects it has on people and families for the good. And especially today, I'm going to talk to you about health, but I define that very broadly to include both physical health and mental health or emotional well-being. We know, and we've known a long time, that the social world is an extremely important influence on health, and that includes social support, like advice and help. That's why there's an Ann Landers, and we all love to call our mothers to talk about our problems. Spatial environments like neighborhoods. The most recent social science research shows a profound influence of where we live on things like asthma rates. Social groups like religious communities are extremely important, and people who attend church regularly are less likely to die in the next period than people who don't. And social institutions like marriage, which is what I'll be talking about today. What I argue, and in my view the research evidence supports, is that marriage itself, and I'll tell you how, changes the choices that people make, which changes their behaviors, which changes their outcomes, which include, in particular, health outcomes. And marriage as a social institution is unique, I think, because it's a public promise between two people to stay together for life. We know in modern society that doesn't always happen, but that's the expectation and that's the promise. Marriage is also socially recognized. Everybody around us knows what we mean when we say we've gotten married or we are married. It's also socially supported. People encourage others in a good community to work on their marriage, to stay with their marriage, to get married. We all know marriage is religiously supported, and that's extremely important because most Americans, you know, are religious people. America is an extremely religious nation, and so religious values play a very important part in the choices that people make. And of course, marriage is legally recognized. Now, that's sort of the good news. The bad news, and I think this is not active, I think I'm only over here. The bad news is that fewer people are married now than were in the 1950s when probably marriage was most common. But what you can see here, I feel a little bit like Darth Vader, but it makes it easier for me to tell you what I'm talking about. This is the percent of all adults who are currently married as of 1950, 1960 through 2008. And you can see that in the heyday of the family in the 1950s, about 70%, between 60 and 70% of the primary groups we're talking about here, whites, blacks, males, and females were married. From that point, this is white males. You can see by 2008, it's more like, what, 55%? For white females, sorry, this doesn't look like that is white females. It's just a little lower, but so it's down, and it's down pretty substantially. But the really big change is the enormous decline in proportion married for blacks. So that by 2008, 30% of adult black women were married, and slightly more of adult black men. This is a profound and unsettling change. But the census figures have people 15 and older, and 15, you know, is a little young to be married. That's a census definition. So I took the people who are prime age adults, and looked at the share of them. These are people 30 to 44, and you can see that there, for these, and this is both whites and blacks, that there has been quite a substantial decline in the prime adult ages of the share of adults, both men and women, who are currently married. So if marriage is a social institution that's for the good, that brings benefits, fewer people have access to those benefits now than in the past. At the same time, this is interesting because I think that most people think that divorce rates in the US are high and rising, when in fact they are high and relatively stable. But since 1980 was about the peak of marriage rates, divorce rates. That's the highest they got, and they've trended downward just a little. So what I would characterize American society as a high divorce society, but divorce rates have been high and stable since about 1980. Now, when I was working on this talk, I thought, well, I want to talk about how marriage works and what are the mechanisms through which it improves people's health. And I thought I really have to tell a different story for men than for women, because I've become convinced that marriage works differently for men than for women. Men and women need different things, and marriage provides different things to them. So for men, it's pretty clear that one of the things marriage gives them is a confidant. When you ask men if they have anybody they can talk to about things that are important to them, they'll most likely name their wife. And that's a very important psychological resource that improves both physical and emotional health. Marriage gives men purpose in life beyond themselves, something to work for, to be generous for and toward. Marriage improves men's habits, their health habits. Sleep better, eat better, drink less, smoke less. So that's the next one. Marriage, it's very clear when men form a close and intimate bond, when they're heading toward marriage, their behavior improves, their habits improve. And we can see that by following people over time. Marriage also gives men social connections. They're more likely to go to church after they marry. They are connected to other pro-social institutions much more after they marry than they were before. They're more connected to their families and to a web of families through their wife. And marriage tends to bring financial stability to men. Married men earn more than they did when they were single. And it's clear to me and to people who work in this area that marriage causes men to earn more by making them better workers and more focused on work. For women, it's a somewhat shorter list. But I don't think that means that marriage is less important for women. It just means that maybe men needed more help. But I'm convinced that one of the main things that marriage does is it gets women financial support and the things that money can buy for themselves and their children. One of the things that money buys is women's time and attention to their children. So married women with children work somewhat less than they did when they didn't have children, because they can rely on their husband's greater efforts to pay for some of that. Marriage also gives women social connections, and I'll show you a little bit about that later, which are very important. But women tend not to come into marriage with bad health habits, with the lack of a confidant, so some of the things that marriage does for men, cleaning up some of the unhealthy behaviors, women don't really need. But you can see that marriage gives men financial stability, and they earn more, but men tend to earn more than women anyway. So it doesn't give men money in the same way it gets women money. Now, This is what started me on this whole line of research, and this is one of the big health benefits of marriage, and I would say one of the biggest ways to be healthy is to not die. So if you start with longevity or survival, I'd say that's the fundamental measure of good health. You're still alive. And this was a study that I did with Lee Lillard that started me thinking about all this, and we followed many American citizens over 18 years, during which time they got married, they got unmarried, and some of them died. And then we used those results this is an illustration of our results, where if you start with 100 people at age 48, and you statistically made them stay in the same marital status, and then watch them die and follow them till they're about 65 years old, what you see is this is the share that are alive, so the higher is better. This is women, that married women after this period are substantially more likely to still be alive than women who are never married or divorced. But widowed women do pretty well. But look at, this is the share of the divorced or never married women who are still alive compared to the married or the widowed. So marriage keeps women alive compared to the alternatives. For men, what you see is the same pattern. The results are even bigger, but widowed men don't do so well either. All the unmarried, the not married men are much more likely to die, all else equal. And we took into account many other characteristics that I'm not showing here, like their education and their race and whether they had children and how long the marriage had lasted and so on. So this is having subtracted out all of that. So when you look at the basic, most fundamental health indicator, it's very clear that married people are advantaged. This is, now, we looked at survival. Now we're going to look at health now. And I have 3 measures of health here that I'm going to show you: physical health, emotional health, and cognitive function. And what we did here was we divided respondents to a very large national study, it was older adults, into groups based on who they lived with. So definitely marriage was a consideration, but married people live in households with others or not. And people who aren't married live in households with others or not. And if we're going to use this, I'm going to use this format throughout the talk, so let me explain it fairly briefly. But if we take just as the standard, the comparison, in this case, married people who live only with their spouse, and say we're going to compare everybody else to them, then this is a deficit. See, that they're the standard, and this anything below that is a reduction, relative reduction, or lower level of health for these other groups. So I hope that that's incredibly clear, and I'm going to use that. And if it's not, you can ask me during the question period. You see these little stars? That means that statistically, this difference is important enough that we should really take it seriously. So there's no little star here, which means married people living alone and married people who only live with their own children have about the same physical health. The 2 groups are similar, so it doesn't really matter for physical health. But married people who live with somebody else, live with their spouse, and it's generally somebody up or down the generations, their parents, their grandchildren, or a cousin or a friend, do worse. Single people who don't live with anybody else are more disadvantaged. Single people who live with their own children, so single mothers, are the most disadvantaged, and single people who live in complicated households, mostly in somebody else's household, are also quite poorly off. So the married with or without own children are have the best health. This is physical health. This is the pattern for emotional health. In this case, it's depressive symptoms. And what you see is basically the same pattern, except that married people who live with their children are a little bit worse off. Maybe a little conflict with their teenagers. It's hard to say. But what you can see here is that single people who live alone, or single parents and single people living in complicated households, are all substantially worse off in mental health than the married. This is cognitive function. When we think about health, we don't really think about cognitive function, but I think we should, because I think we all want to go through old age with our cognitive facilities intact. So the extent to which we manage to do that is a very important indicator of health. And what you see here is something of the same pattern, except that single people living alone don't do too badly. But single people with children and single people in complicated households have lower cognitive function than married people. And the most advantaged are married couples who, at older ages, just live by them, the two of them. So we can see from this, or I argue from this, that married people are advantaged. And I made a bit of an argument about the mechanisms through which marriage does that. But it could be that married people have better health because something about marriage improves their health, or it could be the case that people who aren't married have worse health because something about getting unmarried, losing a marriage, damages health. That becoming widowed or getting divorced harms health. So people who are divorced have worse health because they got divorced. So I'm going to show you some research that I published recently that attempts to separate that. Now, how would divorce or widowhood harm health? First of all, divorce and widowhood are extremely stressful processes. There's a period during which the marriage is ending, either through illness or through conflict, that is extremely stressful. And during that period, people tend not to take very good care of themselves. They have all the stress responses, which we know are terrible for your health. Your blood pressure goes up. You can't sleep very well. You don't exercise. You don't eat well. And that affects your physical health and obviously your emotional health. Both divorce and widowhood lead to a decline in financial resources, which is both directly and indirectly poor for mental and physical health. Directly because you can't buy things that you might need for your health, and indirectly because it's terribly stressful to not have enough money. People lose, especially in divorce, social networks and supports, much less in divorce. But if in a divorce, generally you split your friends and you lose the people who used to be your family. You lose the benefits of specialization. You have to do it all on your own now. And the men lose that confidant. People who lose a spouse are much more likely to be lonely, to feel bereft, than people who haven't been through this. And in many cases, people who lose a marriage are single parents with all of the strains that brings. So it could be, and some people argue, that getting divorced is stressful. It takes a lot of resources, financial, emotional, physical, social, and destroys many of these relations. But being divorced may also be stressful. And if marriage is beneficial, being unmarried then is relatively impoverished in resources. So Being divorced may be stressful, being single may be stressful because you don't have these resources. You don't have that extended family network. And we know that people who have divorced have fewer of many kinds of resources, have fewer social relations, and are at risk for the loneliness or social disconnection that comes from these relative lack of resources. So in this research, what we did was look at people's history of marriage and marital loss at a time in their life when their health was starting to change. So we expected that being married improves health, that the end of a marriage damages health, and that health at any point reflects these two forces, both the benefits of marriage and the costs of marital loss. So we looked specifically for those differences. Here we have the same measure of physical health we had before. And again, we're taking as the comparison group people who are married. These are people from about age 50 to about age 60 in a large nationally representative sample. And we compare the health of those who are currently married to the health of those who were previously married, who could be widowed, divorced, or separated. And you can see that the previously married have, who are now, when we observe them, separated, divorced, or widowed, much worse health than, and this is controlling for their characteristics, how old they are, their race, their education, and so on. But people who have never married also are fairly disadvantaged. But if, in fact, divorce causes declines in health, then we may see the effects of this even among people who remarry. If it's a terrible, stressful time, you go through it for a couple of years, you pull yourself together, you find somebody new, you still had that period when you didn't eat well, you didn't sleep well, when your blood pressure was out of control, and it may be that in fact causes damage that's not fully repaired. And in fact, that's what we find. So here we've separated the currently married into those like the Magglebys and the Hinckleys, who were married once and only once and stayed married to that same person. They're now the comparison group, once and always married. These are the people, the next group, the greens, are the people who are currently married, but they have experienced a marital loss. And you can see that their health is significantly worse. Even though their current situation is the same, this experience that they've had has left a shadow or a scar on their health. They are still, however, quite a bit better off than the people who didn't remarry. So this suggests to me that, and the people who are never married are an interesting comparison group because they got neither the benefits of marriage nor the damage of a marital loss. They've never lost a marriage because they never had one. And you see that they are disadvantaged. But the previously married are disadvantaged more. And the difference, I would suggest, is the cost of divorce or marital loss. But you can see that having ever been divorced or widowed leaves a mark on its physical health even years later. Here it is for emotional health. This is depressive symptoms. We go through the same exercise. So this is everybody currently married, regardless of whether they're remarried or once married. And you see that the emotional health of people who are now separated, divorced, widowed is worse. It's worse for people who've never married. But now that you know where we're going, I can do it quickly. What you see here, and it's very interesting, is that the remarried are a little worse off in emotional health, but it's just a little. So if divorce or widowhood leaves a scar on emotional health, it's a pretty small scar. And re-entering a marriage, which one hopes is a happy marriage, does almost repair the damage. And you see the people who were previously married, who are still unmarried, and those who have never married are disadvantaged on this. So for physical health and emotional health, it's a somewhat different story. For physical health, we see a scar that's pretty substantial. For emotional health, remarriage almost repairs the damage. So this is what I've been telling you about is work that I've been doing for a while. And I wanted to talk to you about work that I'm doing right now. And it's, of course, work in progress. So I'm still thinking about this. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. But when you try to understand what it is about marriage that improves people's health, the social connections are a really important part of it. So marriage ties people to a network of family and friends. It gives them a spouse that they didn't have before. Marjorie Hinckley said, I was just thinking I'd get a husband, and I got $150. But that husband is a valuable resource. Somebody to call on if you need a tire changed, or somebody to help you figure out how to make a machine work, or somebody to talk to about a problem you have, and somebody to help you support your family. So it gives spouses a helpmeet and provides social connections. What we wanted to see is how that worked for men and women, the processes through which that worked, and what people who were not married did to meet these needs and how successful they were. So this is, as I said, work in progress. This is based on a study that I'm heading, where we ask people detailed questions about their networks of family and friends. So, as I said, marriage ties people to a network of family and friends who may make demands. It's not like family is for free, right? They want to borrow money, or they want you to run to the grocery store for them, or they want you to pick up their dog at the groomers, or and they may criticize you. They may be a source of conflict. We know that family fights are among the most painful. So families are mixed, right? They come with resources, but they come with demands and maybe conflict. The same thing with spouses. Spouses are a resource, but they also expect you to do things for the family as a whole. Do the laundry, earn some money, change a tire, take me to the doctor, I'm sick. And of course, spouses can be a source of conflict and criticism. And they provide social connections. We have and tried to measure all of these things in families. We asked people in our study of 3,000 community-dwelling older adults between the ages of 57 to 85 a couple of years ago, and we asked them about the extent to which their spouse was a resource to them, and how often their spouse made demands. Separately, we ask about their family, how often their family was a resource, how often their family made demands, and separately about friends, how often their friends were a resource, how often their friends made demands. We also asked them extensively about the people around them and the people important to them, what their network of connections were. And then we characterized those connections to see whether, in fact, one of the ways that married people achieved better health was through the resources that their partners brought, either through connections or through help and support, and what unmarried people did to meet those same needs, which they couldn't meet through a spouse they didn't have. So here, and we're using the same measure of mental health, it's depressive symptoms, and the same basic presentation. So this is the baseline measure of health. Anything below is worse, anything above is better. And in these analyses, we include measures of supports from spouse, demands from spouse, how many people are in your network, how connected those people are to each other, and then what we think of as the consequence of all this is how lonely or socially connected you feel. Loneliness being the feeling that you're left out, that you don't have anybody to talk to, that there's nobody you can count on. It's a very painful, obviously very negative feeling. And what we find here is, and this is men's mental health, the light blue is married men, the dark blue is unmarried men, and what you see here is for men's mental health, an important positive is the extent to which they say their spouse is a support. So men who say their spouse supports them have better mental health. This one I haven't quite figured out, but the more people surrounding men, and this is unmarried men, the worse their mental health. But not very much. You can see it's a pretty small effect. But for both married and unmarried men, the lonelier, some of this works through loneliness. The lonelier they are, the more depressed they are. This is women, and it's the same dependent variable, different colors, but the dark one is unmarried, the light one is married. And what we see is that for unmarried women, family and friends support is a positive. They don't have a spouse. Remember, for men, it was spouse support. For unmarried women, family and friends support seems to play much the same role. What's also very interesting to me is this is demands from family and friends. And for married women, when they say their family and friends are demanding, that is negatively related to their emotional health. Married women whose family and friends are demanding have worse emotional health. But in both cases, people who are lonely, like we saw for men, are more likely to have high levels of depressive symptoms. Now, as I was thinking about this, I thought we know married women have better mental health than unmarried women, but they have this response to demands from family. Marriage comes often with difficult in-laws or family complexities, but something else about marriage balances that out so that on average they have better mental health. But a lot of it seems to filter through loneliness and the feeling of social connection that tends to come with marriage. This is men's physical health, the same measure we've been using. And what you see is the same way that for unmarried men, having more friends is negative for their physical health, but just very slightly. Having those friends be highly connected to each other is also negatively related to physical health. Now, it's possible that men who have poor health, unmarried men sort of gather their networks around them to help, rather than that these networks are causing the poor health outcomes. But again, we see for both married and unmarried, feelings of connection are extremely important for their physical health. So the emotional, how they feel about all of these people, the way they filter that, how it affects their feelings of connection is very important for their physical health. And this is for women. This got a little bigger. I don't know exactly why. My apologies. And what we see here is, like we saw for mental health, that for married women, demands from family and friends are a big negative. It's one of the tough parts of marriage for women, not for men, which is very interesting. So the family demands seem to land on the woman and to affect both her physical and mental health, which I guess is not a surprise. But for both, well, and this is fairly interesting too, and I haven't figured it out at all, but loneliness here matters for unmarried women, and it's in the right direction, but not as strong for married women. So thoughts on this, I'm excited to have. We're in the middle of this part of the project, and some of it makes a lot of sense and some of it doesn't. But it's clear that for unmarried women, calling on family and friends is an important strategy for dealing with the fact that they don't have spousal support, and that for married women, family demands are a very important consideration, negative, for both their physical health and their mental health. So, how does marriage produce benefits? It's clear to me that it's extremely important that, that marriage produces social connections. It connects people to an intimate other, and that's probably the most important single connection, and can't really be overrated. But in addition, marriage connects people to a network of family, a network of friends, a network of social institutions like churches and volunteer organizations and schools, and that those social connections are extremely important and really change, especially for men, the way they live their lives. In addition, marriage brings, and it's clear that for both men and women, marriage improves mental health. And you can see that if you follow people longitudinally and watch some of them get married. On average, people's mental health improves when they get married, and their mental health declines when they lose a marriage, when they either get divorced or become widowed. So, and I think these findings on loneliness and how important they are both for men and women suggest that the emotional connection, that the social connection with that intimate other is channeled into, becomes an emotional connection that, when it works and works well, leaves people feeling connected, with part of a group, supported emotionally. Those loneliness findings that we saw suggest that when married people don't feel, and this is not very common, but it happens, don't feel connected, that in spite of being married, then the costs are very high in both their physical health and their emotional health. And that support from others, being able to rely on people, being able to talk to people, is extremely important, and it's extremely important for especially men, and especially married men. So the hard part of it is, the hard part of all this research for me is thinking about, if we think that marriage as a social institution is good for people. It's good for adults, it's good for men, women, it's good for children. More than that, it's good for communities. How do we encourage and support marriage? And I don't mean marriage-like relationships. I don't mean alternatives to marriage, but marriage as a legally, socially, religiously recognized institution. What can we do as a community? What can we do as a society to increase the chances that young people want to marry, help them find appropriate people to marry, help them form successful marriages, help them develop the skills to be a good husband or wife. And in contemporary American society, I think that's a big challenge. And I'm afraid that while I have some ideas, I don't have good answers. We live in a culture that I think does not value marriage, where celebrities, many celebrities, have children, form relationships, and influence young adults without getting married. The legal system now makes, I think, it harder to form marriages that are supported by the legal system. No-fault divorce means that everybody who gets married knows that their spouse could leave at any time for any reason, and there's nothing that they can do about it. That fundamentally changes people's choices, makes it much harder for people to invest in marriage, makes it much smarter for them to invest in themselves, and in and of itself increases the chances that people divorce. Absent changes in no-fault divorce, that force makes it much more difficult for people to form lasting marriages. And there are other forces like that at work. So I'm afraid on that score, I don't have solutions. But I think that if the extent to which people know that marriage is an institution which benefits them, then in the long run, and maybe with a lot of work and a lot of talk, attitudes toward marriage will, in the general society, change to be more supportive, more protective, as a society as a whole, and I would hope that people would become more aware of this valuable institution, both for themselves and for society as a whole. Thank you very much.